Snow fell softly on the tin roof of the old trailer, each flake catching what little light remained from the winter sky. The trees stood like dark sentinels around the clearing, silent and unmoving. Smoke curled from the crooked chimney, gray against the pale dusk. Inside, the faint, plaintive cry of a baby echoed, tired, hungry, patient, in the way only small children learn to be when there's no one else coming. Jack stood outside in a worn coat, the zipper long broken. He clutched, a rusted wrench in both hands, like a man holding on to the last piece of himself. His boots sank into the snow, breath misting in front of him, but he didn't move. He was waiting, for something to give, or just for a moment of stillness that didn't feel like loneliness. Every morning followed the same ritual. Feed Molly. Change her. Whisper to her the kind of hope he didn't believe in anymore. Walk to the roadside mailbox, tap it with his knuckles like knocking on a door that never opens. Empty again. He would smile for her, though. Always for her. By mid-morning, he'd be elbow-deep in rusted engines, pulled from the yards of neighbors who'd long given up trying to fix them. Bartered for firewood, canned food, old diapers. He was good with his hands, always had been. But these days, it wasn't about skill. It was about keeping the silence from taking over. The sun was low when the sound came. Sharp, choking, unnatural. Jack looked up to see a silver sedan creeping along the icy gravel road. It jerked to a stop near the tree line, steam billowing from under the hood. The door opened and a woman stepped out, wrapping her coat tighter with trembling hands. She didn't belong here. Her coat was clean, her boots barely scuffed, and her eyes searched the landscape like it might bite. "Clara," she said later, though not right away. At first, she just stood beside her car, arms crossed, pretending not to be freezing. Jack walked over slowly, didn't say much, just offered a nod and a look at the engine. Her words tumbled out. Fast, nervous. Something about driving north, a wrong turn, no signal. She kept glancing back at the road like she expected someone else to show up. He said nothing, just lifted the hood, touched the metal like it was an old friend. The engine was fried, burnt out in places, with a corroded plug that was clearly past saving. She sighed hard when he told her, looked down like she didn't want to be seen helpless. He told her she could sit by the stove while he worked. She hesitated, just for a breath, and then followed him into the trailer. Inside it was warm, but barely. The baby was bundled in an oversized blanket on a pile of folded towels. She blinked up at Clara like she was looking at the moon. Clara blinked back. Jack made coffee, weak, bitter, but hot. He handed it to her without ceremony. Then, from a plastic drawer under the counter, he pulled out the spark plug from his generator, the only one he had. She watched as he cleaned it with careful fingers, then disappeared out into the snow again. Molly made a small sound. A hiccup, or a laugh, and Clara startled. She crouched beside her, brushing a finger along the baby's blanket. When Jack came back, his hands raw from the cold, Clara was still there, her cheeks pink and her eyes softer than before. "It's running." "Now," he said, nodding toward the car. She stood slowly, looked at him, then the baby. She offered money, 3 folded bills she pulled from her pocket. Jack shook his head. "I don't take payment for kindness," he said. "You looked cold." They sat near the fireplace for a moment longer, Molly gurgling between them. The flames danced against the walls, casting their faces in amber light. Clara laughed suddenly, a real, tired laugh. Molly giggled, and for a second, the world didn't feel so heavy. When she left, it was with more than just a fixed car. Something had shifted, though neither of them would name it. She looked back once. He didn't wave, just stood in the falling snow, holding the empty teacup she had used like it meant more than it should. He placed it gently on the shelf beside the window, as though saving it for someone who might come back. Morning crept in beneath a blanket of pale gray, the kind of sky that promised snow without ever delivering it. Jack's trailer groaned. Against the cold, metal expanding and contracting in the slow rhythms of old things that refused to break. Inside, the kettle hissed quietly. Molly stirred in her crib, soft breaths visible in the chill air between them. Jack sat at the edge of the cot, one boot unlaced, staring at the wood stove like it might offer more than warmth. He'd slept in his clothes again. He always did. The days blurred now, just soft repetitions, the rituals of survival. Coffee. Diapers. Silence. He reached for the kettle, just as a sound shattered the morning. A low thunder, not from the sky but from the trees. He paused, kettle in mid-air, then stood slowly, moving toward the door. The noise grew louder, rhythmic, heavy, foreign. Then, impossibly, the branches trembled, and above the clearing, a shape appeared, black, sleek, loud. A helicopter. Jack shielded his eyes as snow scattered in wild spirals around him. The chopper landed clumsily, too close to the edge of the woods, branches whipping the tail. He didn't run, didn't shout, just watched as the doors opened. Two men in dark coats stepped out first. They moved with a careful purpose, scanning the property like it meant something. And then she emerged. Clara. She wore the same coat as yesterday, but it looked different now. Less borrowed, more chosen. Her eyes found him through the snow, and this time she walked with intention. The men waited by the rotors. She crossed the space between them slowly, arms folded, not guarded, just bracing. Jack didn't speak. "I should have called," Clara said, her voice swallowed a little by the wind. "But I didn't think you'd pick up." Jack blinked. "You're back." "I am." He looked past her at the machine, then at the suits. "That yours?" She smiled faintly. "The company's, yes." Silence stretched. The only sound was the whining wind and the whir of metal cooling. "I wasn't honest with you," she said softly. "Not because I didn't trust you, but because I didn't want to be seen. I thought I'd disappear out here. And then, you..." He waited. "You didn't ask who I was, or why I was alone. You gave me your only spark plug." Her breath caught. "That's why I came back." The words hung in the air between them, as fragile as frost. "I run a renewable energy firm," she added, quieter now. "We're working on an off-grid pilot. Sustainable engines, remote sites, low-waste housing. We need someone who understands machines. Someone who can build quietly, steadily, without noise." He shook his head, almost smiling. "You don't want me." She stepped closer, pulled a small box from her coat pocket. "It's not payment," she said, placing it in his hand. "It's just returning something borrowed." He opened the lid. Inside, polished to a mirror finish, lay the spark plug. His spark plug. The one he'd pulled from the generator without thinking. Clean, restored, whole again. "You gave up power to help a stranger," she said. "I'd like to give it back, with more than it had." There was no sales pitch, no clipboard, no pressure. Just the invitation between them, suspended like snow in the stillness. "Room and board?" Jack asked after a long pause. "Yes. Housing for Molly, too. On-site childcare. You'd be part of something small, but real." He closed the box. Clara's eyes searched his. She wasn't selling a job. She was offering something else. A second beginning. A place where all his quiet work might finally mean something more than just getting by. But Jack looked out at the trees, at the clearing, that had held his grief, his daughter's first steps, the silence he'd come to understand like breath. "I've got work here," he said gently. "Engines to fix, mailbox to check." Clara nodded, not surprised. "I thought maybe." He held up the box again. "Thank you for this." She looked down at her boots, then back up at him. "Can I come in? For coffee?" Jack didn't answer, but he stepped aside. Inside, the fire crackled, and the air smelled faintly of ash and baby powder. Molly was awake now, her small hands patting the sides of her crib like she knew something good had returned. Clara bent to greet her, no longer a stranger. Jack poured 2 mugs, thinner than he liked it, but hot all the same. She smiled when he handed it to her. He took the empty teacup from the shelf and placed it beside her again. They sat in quiet, just like before, not needing more. That night, after the helicopter had long disappeared behind the hills and the shadows had folded over the trailer, like an old coat, Jack lit a single candle on the table. He pulled out a sheet of paper, wrote in careful strokes. Dear Em, Molly smiled today. Not the kind she gives me when she's trying to get out of naps. A real one. She met someone who brought the cold in with her and somehow left the place warmer than she found it. I didn't take what she offered. I think you'd understand why. But I wanted to tell you, something small changed. Maybe that's all it takes. Someone to see you and not ask questions, Jack. He folded the letter, placed it in the small cedar box beside Molly's crib. Inside were bits of her first year, a broken pacifier, a tiny sock, a photograph folded at the corners. And now, a letter she would read someday, when she'd understand the weight of a quiet life and what it means to choose it. The snow returned. Around midnight, the wind gentled. And for the first time in months, Jack didn't dream of loss. The days began folding into each other like snowflakes pressed between pages, each one soft, each one nearly the same. Morning coffee, smoke from the chimney, the metallic rattle of tools in Jack's hands. He'd long accepted the slow rhythm of things out here. But sometimes, quiet had a weight, and sometimes it waited to be broken. It came on a Tuesday, a blue envelope tucked between a bill for propane and a flyer for a local church bazaar. Jack stood at the mailbox for longer than he meant to, turning the letter over, feeling its weight. There was no return address. But the handwriting, looped and slanted like words written with a smile, was unmistakable. Inside, Jack, you probably guessed I'd write eventually. The truth is, I've thought of doing it every day since I left, but I wanted to have something worth saying. The project's moving, slowly. But well, we restored an old train turbine. Last week, it reminded me of the way you pulled power out of that engine like it was alive. You probably would have fixed it in half the time. I wanted you to know something. You remind me of my father. He was quiet too. Never asked who people were, just helped. He said a person's hands tell you what kind of life they live. Yours told me I was safe. How's Molly? Is the chimney still fighting smoke? You don't have to write back, but I hope you do. Clara. Jack folded the letter slowly, held it in his hands like something precious, not fragile. He didn't go inside right away. He sat on the porch and read it again, then again. That night, after Molly had gone to sleep, he fixed the door on her crib. Not the sort of thing he'd noticed before. It still held together, still rocked, but now, suddenly, it seemed worth doing right. He sanded the frame, retightened the screws, added padding to the corners. The next day, he repainted the porch, pale gray with a hint of green. The color his wife had once said reminded her of sea glass. By the end of the week, he'd re-insulated the chimney, replaced the torn curtain in the window, and started leaving the red flag up on the mailbox. Just in case. More snow came. Molly grew bolder, babbling at birds outside the frosted window panes, dragging a wooden spoon around like a scepter. Jack found himself laughing more, fixing more, breathing a little easier. And then, another letter, this time in a pale yellow envelope, a little thicker. Jack, I found this and thought of you. Attached is a photo of me, 7 years old, standing, with my father. He was an airplane mechanic in Montana. That engine behind us hadn't flown in years, but he made it sing. I remember the smell of grease on his coat, the way he'd hum when he worked, the way he listened with his whole body. He fixed more than planes, though. He fixed hearts with his hands. So do you, Clara. Inside was the photo. Young Clara in oversized snow boots, grinning beside a tall man with oil-stained hands and a face like carved oak. They stood beside the belly of an old propeller plane, sun glinting off rivets. Jack held the picture between his fingers for a long time, and then, quietly, his face crumpled. He hadn't cried since the hospital, not since that last hour, when the beeping slowed and the nurses left him alone with the silence. But now, Something cracked open. Slow, quiet, deep. He wept at the table, not loudly, not for long, but fully, as though part of him had been waiting for permission. Later, he placed the photo beside the letter in Molly's memory box, next to the folded one he'd written weeks before. Time moved again. December thickened. The snow came heavy and didn't melt. Jack spent more time chopping firewood, less time counting the days. He started making soup in big batches, tucking the leftovers into jars. He built Molly a sled from scraps, rewired the porch light so it didn't flicker. He didn't expect anything more, but he hoped in that quiet way people do when they don't speak it aloud. On the morning of the 22nd, just before Christmas, Jack woke early. The sky was dark. The air was sharp and clean. He sat at the table, brewed a cup of coffee, and pulled out a piece of paper. He stared at the blank sheet for a long while. Then he wrote, "If you still need help with those engines, I have two good hands, and a baby who loves helicopters." He signed it with a smudge of ink and a smile he hadn't known he was wearing. Then, folding the letter with care, he tucked it into an envelope, sealed it, and stepped out into the cold. The snow crunched under his boots. The sun had just begun to rise, the world lit in a soft peach glow. He walked to the mailbox, slid the letter in, left the flag up, and for the first time in a long while, Jack didn't turn away immediately. He stood at the end of his driveway, hands in his pockets, breath ghosting into the air, and waited, for nothing in particular. Just the silence, just the possibility. The snow came down gentler this time, like it had learned something about the world since the last storm. Jack heard the sound before he saw it. The low thumping of rotors folding over the treetops, stirring. The pines like old secrets. He stepped outside. Molly tucked close against his chest in her knit cap, her breath puffing tiny clouds into the cold air. The helicopter dipped lower, less urgent than the first time, and landed in the clearing beside the trailer. Snow kicked up in soft spirals around it, and then, through the open side door, Clara stepped out. She wasn't the same. Her boots were scuffed now, the heels worn down. Her coat had a patch at the elbow, and when she smiled, it didn't feel like a performance. It was quiet. Real. Jack didn't say a word, just nodded. They packed light, what they could carry, what mattered. A bag of clothes, a picture frame, Molly's stuffed bear missing an eye. The rest could stay behind. Clara guided them to the new place, a cabin nestled at the edge of the forest, built for the pilot program she'd once written about in hopeful tones. But this wasn't some sterile tech campus. It was made of wood and stone and wide windows that let the light pour in. There was a long workbench with 3 old engines already waiting, tools laid out with care. Molly squealed when she saw her new crib, handmade from reclaimed oak, with little carvings of animals on the headboard. Jack traced one with his finger, local. "Craftsman?" he asked. Clara grinned. "No, the team made it." The team welcomed Jack like someone they'd already heard stories about. A woman named Tanya offered him coffee before she said hello. A tall man in overalls, whose name Jack never caught, pointed at a row of carburetors and said, "Thought you might want to tune those up." It didn't feel like arrival. It felt like return. Jack settled in slowly, like you do after a long drive or a long grief. He found a small shelf above the tool rack and made a kind of altar. Not religious, just a place for memory. He placed Molly's photo there, one where she was laughing in the snow. His wife's gloves went beside it. And finally, the spark plug, now tucked in the small box Clara had given him, rested gently between them. Every day he worked a little, fixed a little, fed Molly, brewed coffee. Clara visited often, but never stayed too long unless invited. She asked questions Jack didn't mind answering. They talked about design, about balance, about the magic of machines that breathed again after years of silence. At night, the cabin glowed like a lantern in the woods. One evening, Jack sat near the fireplace while Molly toddled across the wooden floor, her steps clumsy but confident. She carried the spark plug box in both hands, serious and proud. Clara watched her, curled on the old reading chair with a blanket over her knees. She turned toward Jack and asked softly, "Do you miss her?" He nodded once. "Every day." Silence. "But she'd be proud," he added, "that I kept the coffee warm." Clara didn't speak, but she smiled and touched his arm gently. Just enough to say, "I understand." The days lengthened slowly. Snow still fell, but the winds had softened. Jack found himself waking before the sun just to start the fire, to ready the space. He rebuilt things not because they were broken, but because they deserved to be whole. One morning, Jack found an envelope in the new mailbox nailed beside the front steps. Same handwriting. He opened it at the kitchen table, the scent of cinnamon and fresh pine in the air. "Jack, this place was never meant to be mine alone. I dreamed it up in a lonely apartment during the worst winter of my life. I built it with the hope that someone else would believe in it. But I never imagined it would feel like this. Like home. Thank you for making it that. Clara." Jack read the letter twice, then folded it with care and placed it in the memory box beside his wife's gloves. Later that night, as the wind whispered, outside and the fire burned low, Molly slept soundly in the crib Jack had built. Her little breaths rose and fell in rhythm with the crackling coals. Clara sat across from him, a book in her hands, her hair soft in the firelight. She looked up and met his eyes. Jack stirred the fire, then leaned back, the chair creaking under him. He exhaled slowly and whispered, "It's warm enough now." No one replied. They didn't need to. Outside, snow coated the trees like frosting on an old world that had learned how to hush. Inside, in flickers and fragments, a family was forming, not all at once, not with declarations or promises, but in the daily rituals. The laughter of a child, the soft closing of a letterbox. In patient pieces, love had returned to the room. If this story touched you, subscribe or share where you're watching from. These stories matter.